We should begin this lecture by first making a distinction between Islam as a religion consisting of very specific set of beliefs and practices, and a religion which is embraced by over 1.5 billion people across the globe. It might surprise some people to know we often associate Islam with the Arab people of the Middle East, and there is obviously some basis for that. But in fact, the vast majority of Muslims do not reside in the Middle East. Probably the single largest Muslim majority country population wise is Indonesia. It might surprise some people to know that the country with the most Muslims, wherein they constitute a minority, but nonetheless there are more of them there than any other country, is India. Just a lot of people there. And of course, Islam is practiced not only in the Middle East, but also in Central Asia, in parts of Southeast Asia, in Africa, not just North Africa, but many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Europe. And of course, you have Muslim communities around the world, including in the United States. But our focus here is more on Islamic civilization. Because with the advent of Islam, it's going to lay the foundations in many ways for an entirely new civilization, defining not just a belief system, but also certain values and just ways of thinking about how to organize society, politics, and so forth. That's primarily centered in the Middle East, but will embrace many regions far beyond that. So first of all, just making that distinction. And of course, when we think about the beginnings of Islam, or in this case, Islamic civilization, we do focus on the Middle East. Hence why we have a map here. This is the modern Middle East, right? So obviously, the various borders that you see here don't apply. We're looking at the very early history of Islam. And in fact, we tend to focus primarily on Arabia. Back in the day, it would not have been called Saudi Arabia. Saudi or Saudi, that reflects the current ruling dynasty of that particular state. And so that's a rather modern, very recent phenomena. Now, the Middle East has often seen many different influences coming in, intermixing, and so forth, in large part because of its location. It's at the crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa, between three continents. If we're looking at the beginnings of Islam, we're looking at a period not too long after the end of the Western Roman Empire. By this time, what remained of the Roman Empire of the East had started to evolve into something new, what we call the Byzantine Empire. And we should also note that one very important influence is going to be an Iranian civilization going back, at this point, already hundreds of years. And so very, very highly developed civilization that will eventually have an impact on the manner of Islamic civilization's development. But in any event, right, the Middle East, first and foremost, an area that has constantly been under pressures coming from outside people, a lot of migration in and across the region, trade, and so forth. Now, when we think about the beginning of Islam slash Islamic civilization, we tend to focus on Arabia. I think many people have a general idea about the kind of topography, the kind of terrain that's involved. We tend to think of that area as being desert, and I mean, sometimes that gets exaggerated, but there is some basis to that. So some of the biggest deserts, best known deserts in the world are actually located in the Middle East or in North Africa. So Islam arises in this, what one could call a very inhospitable part of the world. But we should be careful, right? I mean, some desert looks like what we see here. This is actually a really large area of desert in present-day Saudi Arabia known as the Ruba al-Khali, or empty quarter. It's about the size of France. And I mean, this is, a kind of environment that you just cannot survive in, right? So, I mean, it's almost entirely lacking in any kind of water source, rivers, lakes, any kind of growth, with sand dunes sometimes the size of small mountains, right? So you're not going to really see anything happening there. But you have other kinds of terrain in the desert that are a little bit more hospitable, where you find some growth, a certain amount of water in the form of oases. Though again, it's still a very difficult environment, but a limited number of people could eke out, kind of livelihood in this kind of environment. But it would be very competitive, right? So I mean, very limited resources. and really only capable of supporting a limited number of people. And very likely these people would have to move around a lot, looking for whatever scarce resources they could find. There would be very kind of short periods during the spring where maybe you have some forage, perhaps for herds of sheep, or in this environment we're probably talking more camels. So it would be kind of nomadic existence, and this is a part of the Arabian Desert in the northern part of what is present-day Saudi Arabia, and this is in fact much closer to the area where Islam is going to arise. Now, the people that we're talking about are known as the Arabs. The word Arab actually refers to their mobility. Araba in Arabic referring to this kind of mobility, moving around a lot. And so we are talking about a nomadic people, hence the name. More specifically, we often refer to these particular nomadic people as Bedouin. Today, you still have some Bedouin in parts of the Middle East, North Africa, though we should note they're kind of dying out, partly because it's generally the policy of modern states to try and settle these populations. Generally don't like them moving around a lot. They tend to cross borders, very difficult to tax and so forth. But back in the day, I mean, the vast majority of people occupying the Arabian Peninsula would have been nomadic. Known as the Arabs, they spoke the language Arabic, so ethnically speaking, we might say that they were Arabs, and definitely very much on the move, migrating constantly, following the seasonal availability of groundwater, often having herds of camels, sometimes sheep, but more often camel. So, you have to move around where you're looking for whatever limited forage there is for them, and then having to move on once that's used up. Camels, of course, very suited to life in the desert. We talked about camels a bit with the trans-Saharan trade when we were looking at developments in Africa. So very much capable of surviving in such a harsh environment. And, if you were a Bedouin, you would have been basically surviving off whatever the camels could provide, perhaps supplementing it with dates, occasionally having some meat and bread. And that would have been your staple diet. Sometimes, perhaps, interacting with the very limited number of settlements that would have been on the periphery of the desert. So it was a very difficult existence and a very competitive one, right? So Arab society back in the day, to some degree, there's still some basis to this. Very often Arabs today even are aware of what clan or tribe they belong to, though it doesn't often mean that much today. Back in the day, it meant a lot, right? Your clan, and then clans would come together to form a larger tribe. This was, in effect, your extended family. And very often you would migrate together, certainly the clan, sometimes with other clans from the tribe, and you would hold property in common. And it was very important that you were prepared to defend your tribe. Your tribe is also prepared to defend you, right? So if somebody in your clan, for instance, were to be killed by somebody from another clan, you would be obligated to avenge them. There would be a strong sense of honor involved, right? That anyone harmed or certainly killed who was a member of your tribe or clan, you had to avenge them. And ideally, of course, you would be quite happy to track down the individual responsible, but the next best thing would be killing someone belonging to that clan or tribe. The problem with this, of course, is that it could lead to a blood feud. And, I want to be clear, this is something, it's not unique to Arab tribal society. We're going to see kind of, a similar kind of dynamic when we look at Germanic tribes that, towards the end of the Roman Empire started migrating into Europe. You even have episodes of this kind of thing in the history of the United States. Probably one of the most famous blood feuds in American history being the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? And the problem with this, it becomes kind of a tit-for-tat thing, where at some point you might not even really remember how the whole thing started. All you know is that you're now obligated to avenge somebody who was killed in your clan, and then after you kill somebody from that clan, someone in that clan has the same sense of obligation with respect to yours, right? So you very often had this problem of blood feuds existing between tribes. Now, fortunately, Arabia is a very, very large place. We talked about how even just this one section the empty quarter being about the size of France. So clans, who are having a blood feud, or tribes that are having a blood feud, could go months or even years without encountering one another, right? So it wasn't a regular occurrence, but nonetheless it did happen. And we should note also that in connection with this kind of very competitive dynamic, it was quite legitimate for one tribe to raid another tribe or even raid a settlement. I mean, this was not considered dishonorable or even somehow constituting theft, right? So it's just this very kind of competitive environment with respect to very, very limited resources. Now, within the tribe, and certainly within the clan, it's a very kind of egalitarian structure, right? So while, relations between tribes are often violent, again, there was kind of this idea that it was perfectly legitimate to get involved in a raid or skirmish against a rival tribe or even a settlement. This was even a kind of test of strength. Within the tribe, relations usually tended to be very peaceful. This, again, was kind of like an extended family. There was very little by way of political hierarchy in terms of some people being superior to others. Though very often you would have a kind of council of older men who were highly respected, who in some fashion would act as a kind of local government, right? But I mean, one achieved this position basically because you became someone highly respected, right? And so, within that council, there might even be one individual, somebody highly venerated, i.e., respected, usually someone quite older, who would be designated a sheikh, right, who would act as a leader of the clan, and then also, someone within the tribe as a whole who might hold that function. But again, this was not something hereditary. This was not something where you had this kind of formal kind of mechanism for determining who should hold that position. It's just something that would evolve because someone became highly respected. And even in that regard, right, it was, only the fact that they were respected that gave them any kind of authority. People were inclined to take their lead. So this is the kind of environment within which Islam is going to arise. We should also note the broader geopolitical environment at the time of the advent of Islam, where Arabia and the Middle East, kind of as a whole, is sandwiched between two really great empires, right? So on the one hand, you have the Byzantine Empire centered around the eastern part of the Mediterranean, what had once been Eastern Roman Empire. At some point, at least historians, we start to see it evolving to something a bit different. We call it the Byzantine Empire. And the other great empire would have been the Sassanid Empire based in present-day Iran, one more incarnation of these ancient Persian empires. So, sometimes we say Persia, sometimes Iran, pretty much the same territory. And we might know the Byzantine Empire, probably the most important city, and one of the great cities in the world at this point, the capital of Constantinople at the juncture between Europe and Asia, what today is modern-day Istanbul in the modern state of Turkey. So just a little bit of background. The Byzantine Empire, effectively a Christian empire, Christianity, in fact, being designated the state religion, and no other religion, in fact, no anything other than the state-sanctioned version of Christianity was considered unacceptable. Right, so very difficult, for instance, for Jews to reside in the Byzantine Empire, but also sects of Christianity where some of their beliefs were viewed as heretical, as wrong belief. And in some ways, Christians of that ilk were more likely to be persecuted than non-Christians, right? So a Christian empire with a very specific form of Christianity, what today we call Orthodox Christianity. So the Sassanid Empire, in a sense, also has its own official religion, Zoroastrianism, which we learned a bit about the origins of that particular religion when we looked at the early history of the Persian Empire. But it might be better to say that it's not so much the official religion, but the religion of the political elite. They're pretty much indifferent to what religions are practiced by subject populations, extremely tolerant in that regard, and very different from the Byzantine Empire in that sense. Uh, and partly because of that, you have large numbers of non-Orthodox Christians and Jews fleeing persecution from the Byzantine Empire who end up residing there. Uh, the kind of negative aspect of it is that these subject populations are not really invested in the kind of political system or political lead. I mean, there's very little attempt even to bring these people into the Zoroastrian fold. It's kind of seen as a kind of elite religion. So in a sense, even discouraging that kind of development, but meaning there's kind of a disconnect between subjects and the ruling elite, and that could pose a problem down the road if they should come under attack. So that brings us to the more immediate environment with respect to the beginnings of Islam. So, we talked about how the Arabs are predominantly a nomadic people, but in fact, there are a number of settlements that have emerged by the time that Islam is getting underway. And one that's going to prove especially important with respect to the early history of Islam is the settlement and we could even say large town or city of Mecca, right? And we talked a bit with the trans-Saharan trade back when we were looking at the early history of Africa, how, oases could be quite large. They could actually sustain large populations, even cities in some cases. So in the case of Mecca, this was a settlement that eventually became very important in connection with the caravan trade, much of which was coming from the south of Arabia, working its way up to the Mediterranean. And so passing through some of these oases, communities like Mecca, and Mecca became kind of very important in connection with the trade related to that, these caravans going back and forth up along the caravan routes, right? So by the 6th century, it's a pretty wealthy town. There are other settlements, such as on this map you see Medina, known today as Medina, back then known as Yathrib, and we'll learn more about that in a bit. So that was kind of more an agricultural settlement, right? So different settlements might develop differently, at least economically. And we should note that Arabia, being sandwiched between these two empires, very often being kind of drawn into the conflict that often takes place between them. Um, so some parts of Arabia occasionally falling under either Roman or Persian rule, but thus also being influenced culturally by both of these empires. Related to that, even though the vast majority of Arabs are pagan, you're going to have some that are Christian and even Jewish because they've been exposed to these faiths. Sometimes they're taking part as kind of mercenary, kind of mercenary troops fighting for the one or the other. But particularly in the center and the northern part of Arabia, just trying to maintain their independence, right? And Mecca, for the most part, kind of remaining independent of this conflict. So Mecca had become very important in connection with the caravan trade, but it also became a very important site of religious pilgrimage because it housed one of the most important religious shrines, a pagan shrine at the time of Muhammad, and related to that became a major site of pilgrimage. And that shrine is known even today as the Kaaba. Today it's an Islamic shrine, but back then it was a pagan one. And so, back in the day, it supposedly housed up to 360 idols representing various deities that were venerated and worshipped by various tribal Arabs. And so they would actually come there in order to worship. And these two things ended up becoming linked. Pilgrimage to this religious shrine ended up becoming linked to the caravan trade, right? So how did that work, right? Well, here's the thing, right? If you were actually coming to the Kaaba to worship, the area around the Kaaba was considered sacred, what we call haram. Related to that, no violence could take place within the precinct of the Kaaba. Well, considering the problem of blood feuds, this was a really good thing, right? So if you came to do pilgrimage, right, you came to do pilgrimage, but you might stick around to do a bit of trading, and you could feel pretty confident that somebody wasn't going to stab you in the back, right? During the time of pilgrimage, a truce was maintained between the members of different Bedouin tribes. So the two things become kind of interlinked in a very positive way for the Meccans, right? People residing in Mecca are going to become very wealthy in connection with the pilgrimage and trade, and the fact that these two things become interconnected. Now, I should point out, a lot of what I'm telling you right now about Mecca represents kind of Islamic traditions about the early history of Islam and the pre-Islamic period. And so most of what we know about Mecca from this period actually comes from things like the Quran, other religious texts concerning the early life of Muhammad. That doesn't mean they're unreliable, but they are certainly interested sources, and as a historian, we have to be aware of that. To be quite frank, we have no non-Islamic sources regarding the life of Muhammad, right? So we have no non-Islamic sources that can even confirm that he existed. Most historians think he did, I mean, to be clear. And it's in some ways not a very different problem from the history of the life of Jesus. In the case of Jesus, we have no non-Christian sources that can confirm his existence. And again, most historians feel that he probably existed, though there it's a little trickier even. Muhammad, I think, we feel we're a bit more on solid ground. But that is worth noting, right? So as historians, we do have to be mindful of our sources. So what do we know about Muhammad, right? So Muhammad was, born into this world. He's the founder of Islam. Again, a word of caution, much of what we know about his early life based on Islamic tradition. And from a strictly historical point of view, that means that, we're always a little bit skeptical about some of what's being related. Having said that, really you don't have any, like stories about Muhammad performing miracles and things of that nature like you have with Jesus. And Muhammad is not central to Islam in the same way that Jesus is to Christianity, right? So whereas Jesus is considered to be God taking the form of man, God incarnate on earth, Muhammad is, at the end of the day, I mean, from a Muslim point of view, simply a man, right? A very, very important man, a very good man, but a human being. And so, and this is something actually that is greatly stressed in Islam. Even this kind of discouraging of elevating him too much because it might distract people from focusing their worship on God. Related to which, it's very often discouraged that you should show images of Muhammad, right? The way that if you go into a church, you very often find paintings and icons, statues, and so forth depicting Jesus. This kind of thing heavily discouraged in Islam. That, for instance, if you want to represent him, you might do it through a kind of, a beautiful rendering of his name in Arabic script, such as we see here. Or if you do show his figure, you might cover his face, as we see here, right? And this is a depiction of Muhammad in connection with the Kaaba. So, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was born in Mecca in 570. His mother died when he was about 6. His father had already died at that point, so at this point he became an orphan. But his grandfather took responsibility for him temporarily. But then he died, and eventually he came under the wing of his uncle, a fellow named Abu Talib, who was a caravan merchant, right? So the first 40 years of Muhammad's life are fairly unremarkable. According to tradition, he's a highly respected individual, but nothing really unusual happens. They don't talk about him having any kind of special religious role or some kind of ability in that regard. In terms of his tribal and clan affiliation, Muhammad belongs to the Hashim clan. It's one of the weaker clans of the Quraysh tribe. And the Quraysh tribe pretty much dominates Mecca. And most important would be the Umayyad clan. And you do want to remember both the names, the Hashemite clan, the one to which Muhammad belonged, and the Umayyad clan, which is the dominant clan in Mecca and probably the wealthiest clan in Mecca. Now, Muhammad belongs to a weak clan, but we should note that his uncle Abu Talib is a highly respected and individually a fairly powerful man in Mecca. And why is that important? Because if, for instance, later on Muhammad should prove unpopular with someone, you would be very reluctant to go after him. If you pick a fight with him, you're picking a fight with Abu Talib, and you might have a blood feud on your hands, right? So in that regard, Muhammad enjoys the protection of his uncle, even though belonging to a relatively weak clan. Now, Muhammad later marries a merchant widow who's 15 years older than him, named Khadija. And until her death, she will be his only wife, even though in Arab society at that time, men are permitted in most clans and tribes. There's a lot of debate about this, but in most cases are permitted an infinite number of wives. And we probably should say something about that. A lot of that reflected the problem of blood feuds. So very often within a clan, you might end up with a large number of women who were widowed, and there was kind of an expectation that the brother of the husband who had been killed would then marry the woman so she would continue to enjoy the protection of the clan. I'm not saying that it was a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly a very misunderstood practice. Of course, today in Islam, according to Islam, you're only permitted 4 wives, but in actual fact, the vast majority of Muslims only have one. And in many countries, the legal system is set up in a way to really highly discourage polygamy or even make it illegal, regardless of what is permitted in Islam. Just wanted to kind of get that out of the way. So, for the first 40 years of his life, nothing unusual happens to Muhammad. I mean, he becomes a kind of respected merchant working with his wife Khadija. They have a very, very positive relationship. They're both very supportive of one another. And at some point, according to tradition, Muhammad began to take up the practice of periodically going out into the desert and meditating in a cave. And one time when he was doing this, he suddenly had an encounter, is probably the best term, in the year 610 during the Arabic month of Ramadan, and some of you are familiar with the importance of that month in the Islamic calendar, where Muhammad received a visit from the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel informed Muhammad that he had been appointed the messenger of God, and he was to call upon the Arabs to submit. And by the way, that is what the word Islam means. It's the verbal noun for aslama, meaning to submit to God's will. Amongst other things, this also meant that they were to worship the one and only true God. There is only one God, and that is Allah. So I want to say a couple of things here. First of all, this idea of submitting to God's will is not unique to Islam, even if it's a bit more pronounced. It's a little bit like this idea that we often find in Christianity, that, God has a plan for you. You have the free will to choose to go another course, but this is kind of like swimming against the current, right? So the easiest thing to do is to bring your own will into alignment with what God has planned for you. So it's kind of that idea. One other way to think of it is, according to Islam, everything has its Islam. Rocks, trees, animals, grass, the wind, and so forth. And everything except for human beings have no choice but to follow their Islam, right? Whatever is kind of the larger plan that God has for the world. Only human beings can choose not to follow their Islam. But of course, things will go much better for you if you bring yourself, your own will, into alignment with what God has in mind for you. The other thing is, just to make clear, right? In Arabic, the word Allah literally means God. Every now and then I'll hear someone say, oh, Muslims don't worship God. Like we do, they worship this other being called Allah. This is just the Arabic word for God in effect, right? So if you were reading a Christian Bible translated into Arabic, you would see the term Allah in reference to God. Saying that Allah is somehow someone different is like saying Spanish-speaking people don't worship God, they worship Dios. So I just want to make sure that everyone is clear on that. So Muhammad has been called upon to go to the Arabs, beginning with the Meccans, and to tell them they need to stop worshiping all these different gods. They need to submit to the one true God. There is only one God, and that is Allah. And, Muhammad, his first reaction is that he's lost his mind, right? He actually goes to Khadija. He's like, I think I've snapped. She goes to a Christian cousin of hers who, after she explains what had happened, he's like, no, this is the real deal. Your husband is a prophet. And we should know, right? Muhammad will periodically go back to the cave where he will receive a new prophecy from Gabriel. These will continue throughout his life. Each prophecy will eventually be written down and come to constitute a chapter or surah in the Quran. The term Quran means recitation because the very first time Gabriel spoke to Muhammad, the first thing he said was recite, a kind of repeat after me. And that is the essence of the Quran, a collection of these different prophecies. Now, as far as this mission that Muhammad's been sent on, it's going to be pretty hard going in the beginning. The wealthy Meccans are greatly concerned about this, particularly the Umayyad clan. They see this as a threat to the source of their wealth and power. But they're like, well, it's really a shame what happened to Muhammad. He was such a good fellow. But it doesn't seem many people are responding to his message, so probably the best thing is to ignore him. And it will be very tough going in the beginning. Muhammad does make a number of very important early converts, particularly with respect to later developments in the early history of Islam. One is his cousin Ali, the son of Abu Talib, his uncle and protector, who, by the way, never converts to Islam, even though he makes it clear that Muhammad continues to enjoy his protection. So if you mess with him, you're messing with Abu Talib. And the other will be his best friend, Abu Bakr. Eventually, though, things will pick up. He'll start to make more and more converts. And at some point, the Meccans are very concerned. Again, particularly the Umayyad clan, the dominant clan in Mecca, who respond very negatively to Muhammad's message. Again, a grave threat to the source of their wealth and power, right? In particular, the pilgrimage related to the pagan shrines in the Kaaba. They can't go after Muhammad, though. So long as Abu Talib is alive, if you go after him, you're going to start a blood feud, which, it's one thing if it happens out in the desert. If it's within a settled community, you're going to have a big problem. They can go after some of his followers, who we might refer to as Muslims, those who have submitted to the will of God. It is the active participle of the word Islam. Some will flee to Ethiopia, where they are given sanctuary by the Christian king there, who sees them as fellow monotheists. But for a while, they can't go after Muhammad. But then in 619, his uncle Abu Talib and his wife Khadija, very important source of moral support, both die. And at that point, it's pretty clear that Muhammad and his followers will soon have to leave Mecca, or they will be killed, right? It's only a matter of time. So lo and behold, opportunity presents itself. As it turns out, about 270 miles north of Mecca, in the oasis town of Yathrib, now known as Medina, the word Medina literally meaning city, as in city of the prophet, so eventually we'll take that name. But for now, Yathrib, an agricultural settlement recently settled by a number of tribes that are starting to get into a blood feud with one another. So they're having a bit of a problem there, right? Again, right? It's one thing if you have a blood feud between nomadic tribes that are wandering around the desert. If they all should happen to settle down in the same place, you're going to have to find a way to resolve that. I didn't mention there is one way to resolve a blood feud without violence. If both parties involved agree to arbitration by a third neutral party, right? To find someone respected by both, who will render a verdict that both will agree in advance to abide by. And so they've gotten word about Muhammad, somebody who seems to have prophetic abilities in neighboring Mecca. And so a delegation arrives and approaches him and asks if he would help settle the blood feud happening in Yathrib. And he agrees on the condition that Yathrib would grant him and his followers sanctuary, allow them to relocate to Yathrib, and afford them protection. And this is going to lead to the seminal event in the early history of Islam. So just very quickly summarizing, right? So Muhammad has been invited by this delegation to act as an arbiter between this one tribe and another one with whom they're quarreling, though they're both in agreement about this. And we should note, in some ways, the problem has to do with three other very powerful tribes that happen to be Jewish, with whom they share the oasis, right? So these two tribes feel that because of their kind of infighting, they're finding it difficult to protect themselves against these other tribes. I mention these three Jewish tribes because, uh, well, we'll get to it in a bit, but it does kind of reflect an incident that's going to have repercussions until the present. In any event, again, Muhammad basically says, I agree to act as an arbiter, but in return, you have to allow me and my followers sanctuary in Yathrib. And so in September of 622, by the so-called Christian calendar, Muhammad and his followers depart for Yathrib in what comes to be known as the Hijrah, a term literally meaning migration. This is going to mark year one on the Islamic calendar, which, by the way, and some of you probably know this, is a lunar calendar. Lunar calendar shorter than a solar calendar, meaning that, among other things, the months of the lunar calendar kind of move through the seasons over the course of time. The month of Ramadan, for instance, sometimes falling in the winter, sometimes the summer, and so forth. But really, kind of the more important question is, why is this event, the Hijrah, so important that it marks the beginning of the quote-unquote Islamic era? And there are kind of two things here. First of all, up until now, if you had converted to Islam, you kind of had this feeling of being pulled in two different directions. On the one hand, your primary loyalty is now supposed to be to your fellow Muslim, regardless of what clan or tribe they might belong. On the other hand, based on the nature of tribal society, you still feel somehow an obligation or a sense of loyalty to the tribe from whence you came, or the clan from whence you came, right? Now, when you relocate to Yathrib, or let's just say Medina from now on, because that's what we call it today, you've pretty much cut all ties with the Quraysh tribe from whence you came, right? Your loyalty is now wholly devoted to the ummah, the community or nation of believers, right? And the idea that all Muslims are brothers, in a sense, they constitute a kind of super tribe, if you will. It's never going to work quite as perfectly as that. Clan and tribe will continue to matter to some degree, but at least that's kind of the idea. The other thing is, from this point forward, Muhammad is not just a religious leader, he is a political leader. So these two things, in a sense, really mark a kind of cutoff point between what was and what will come. So how does it go for Muhammad in the beginning? Well, Yathrib, or Medina, an agricultural settlement. Initially, they're not particularly impressed with the Meccans, who really don't know a rake from a hoe. I mean, they came from kind of a more, merchant background. At some point, Muhammad takes to raiding the caravans that are traveling between Syria and Mecca, which, remember, raiding is a perfectly legitimate kind of enterprise. It's something highly respected if you're successful. And as it turns out, Muhammad's really good at it. Proves actually to be an effective military leader. And by the way, it's a good way to stick it to your enemy. I mean, the Meccans are still gunning for the Muslim community and for Muhammad, who they still perceive as a threat to their trade and the pilgrimage and so forth. Obviously, once the caravans are being attacked, that feeling is going to be even stronger. So that's going to kind of start to make an impression initially on the Medinans. Now, I mentioned there were three Jewish tribes. So when Muhammad first arrived there, he looked to them for support, this kind of idea that he's a prophet. And we should note that Islam is going to incorporate many ideas, many of the same stories and prophets and whatnot that we find in Judaism and Christianity, such as Moses, David, Solomon, and even Jesus, who in Islam is the most important prophet after Muhammad. But in Islam, he is a prophet. Right? So they share many of the same stories about miracles, even about the idea that Jesus was born to a virgin, but they definitely do not support the idea that Jesus is somehow God. They do agree with the crucifixion, though they believe that God pulled a kind of switcheroo at the last second. Early on, Muhammad looking to the Jewish tribes to lend their support to his claim of prophecy. They kind of refused to accept him as a prophet. More importantly, in their conflict with the Meccans, it did appear on a number of occasions that the Jewish tribes were helping out the Meccans, that they were supporting the Meccans. what we sometimes call the enemy from within, or a fifth column that is siding with the enemy. And so the first time this happened, Muhammad basically forced one of the Jewish tribes to go into exile. The second time, the same thing. The third time, he had all the men killed and the women and children sold into slavery, which would have been a very typical practice in tribal Arabia, and indeed probably expected of him, after, for the third time, the Jewish tribes had tried to betray him. And we find passages in the Quran, prophecies that were handed down in connection with these events, that do seem to speak very disfavorably of Jews, when in fact they're really referring very specifically to these three Jewish tribes. The reason why I'm bringing it up is because very often you'll find things on the internet, trying to demonstrate how Islam has a very hostile attitude towards Jews. You'll find quotes taken from these passages, but they're being taken out of context. Again, they refer to these very specific incidences and these very specific Jewish tribes. There are many, many other passages in the Quran that speak favorably of Jews and Christians in general as fellow monotheists. And in fact, Islam will demonstrate a tremendous tolerance of Jews and Christians and other religions as well. As eventually it lays the foundations for a new civilization. But I just wanted to bring that up because you might come across that, and you should be aware of kind of what's going on. In any event, coming back to the larger story, there's nothing like success to breed success. Probably the turning point is when, in March 624, the Muslims are confronted by a Meccan army that's much larger than what they can actually bring to the field. The army of about 1,000. This happens at an oasis called Badr, so this becomes like one of the major kind of military battles between the Meccans and the Muslim community, and though greatly outnumbered, Muhammad's forces prevail. First of all, I mean, again, it shows that he is a formidable, not just political, but also military leader. And within tribal Arabia, this is something that is going to draw people to him, in this case, also to the religion that he's promoting. And some are actually starting to think maybe his message is correct. Maybe he enjoys the favor of God. Stories are told about how the angels fought alongside Muhammad and the Muslims. And to make a long story short, before too long, Muhammad has pretty much united all of Arabia. The last to fall is Mecca. And so eventually Muhammad, after he's united most of the Arab tribes, will come into confrontation with Mecca. The first time this happens, they kind of agree to a truce with an understanding that Muhammad and the Muslims will be allowed to come to Mecca the following year, which they do, at which point the Muslims bring Mecca under their authority. They abolish the worship of all these idols, and the Kaaba becomes a shrine to the one true God of Allah. Right? After that, whatever parts of Arabia had not been brought under his control are united under the banner of Islam. By Muhammad's death on the 8th of June in the year 632, exactly 10 years after the Hijrah, nearly all of the Arab tribes were Muslim. But Muhammad has just died, and this is going to raise some very interesting questions about what will happen next.